Good morning and welcome, everyone. I'm Brian Hansen. I'm Vice President for Studies here at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and I want to welcome you to this morning's program with Bill Weld, former governor of Massachusetts and 2020 presidential candidate. This program is part of our America in 2020 series, and the 2020 presidential election is going to be decided in significant part by the Midwest, and key issues like trade wars, immigration, and others we know are driving the debates. We believe at the Council that access to balanced views on economic, political, and social factors that are influencing American foreign policy are critically important and for people to understand. Therefore, in the lead up to the election, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs is bringing candidates, policymakers, and thought leaders like Governor Weld to Chicago so that you can hear them and talk to them directly. We hope you'll join us again to hear new ideas, meet people who are affecting change, and have your voice heard on the issues that matter most to you. Before we get started today, just a couple of housekeeping remarks. The Council is an independent, nonpartisan organization, and the views expressed on our stage are those of those who express them and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. Additionally, as a tax-exempt 501c3 organization, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs does not support or oppose any candidate for political office and is prohibited from any political fundraising. Please silence your phones, but not your voices. I want to note that this event is on the record and we are live streaming. We also welcome your social media engagement. Following Governor Weld's remarks, I will join him and facilitate a conversation between the two of us, and then we'll open it up for discussions from the audience, both in the room and online. We aren't going to be taking live questions, but we will take them through our social media platform. So in order to submit a question, pull out your phone, go to your browser, and type ccga.live, and then you can select today's program, type a question in, and it will appear up here for me to ask. So please join me in welcoming Governor Bill Weld to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Brian, and thank you, everybody. I'm delighted to be here with you. I'd like to talk today about where we as a country need to be going in the world, and then about where I think the Republican Party needs to be going. The first point is that there is, of course, an American-led world order. Battered though it is, it needs tending and is worth attending to because the world order that we, the United States, helped to create and maintain has contributed to the long period of nuclear peace since 1945 and spread prosperity and democracy to millions, really billions, who never before knew either of those things. And this world order has protected our prosperity as it protects others. Mr. Trump and his Kremlin cronies have given this American-led world order a beating, but have yet to destroy it. It consists in a long line of agreements that we just take for granted or thought we did. The belief that barriers to trade should go down, not up. The doctrine that a few basic protections for human rights should be imperative. The understanding that the United States helps protect established democracies and promotes nascent ones. I say this particularly with regard to free trade, which Mr. Trump regards as a mug's game. Mr. Trump has not just hurt the pockets of American farmers, though he has done that. He has not just created uncertainty that spooked the markets and almost took us into recession, though he has done that. He has not just made our allies and friends lose confidence in America's word, though he has done that. He has told all of America's allies and partners that we are not serious about the principles of the free world that we helped create through all those years. If we don't say we believe in them, nobody will, and that will have consequences. It will hurt American taxpayers, and it may well, down the line, lead to conflicts that cost American lives. So we need to reaffirm our commitment to keeping trade free and open and fair. It's good for our wallets, yes, all of ours, anyone who buys things. But it's also what keeps the world from breaking down into power blocks that prepare to fight one another. We have to change that. The next point is that we need to defend that order in ways that conserve our strength rather than dissipate it, particularly when we are on a budget. There's something that I think gets lost in the arguments between neocons and isolationists, which is that successful American policy over the years has charted a middle course between the two of them. We must protect the world order we helped set up. Our allies need us, and we need our allies. We're in the world together, and together we need to stand up to enemies of freedom that would remake the world and us in their image. Our way of life depends on doing that. But equally, we must avoid squandering American blood and treasure trying to fix the unfixable. We have experience with those types of conflict. We need prudent leadership to avoid getting sucked into them. Successful American foreign policy avoids both too little and too much engagement and military force. Go one way and you get Munich, go the other way and you get Vietnam. Where conflicts in the Middle East are concerned, we need to be careful not to get stuck spending American lives and American tax dollars trying to make people who don't live like us live like us. That's not an argument for taking no notice of terrorism or weapons of mass destruction or threats to American allies. But it is an argument for not promising too much or getting bogged down when we are also needed elsewhere. Above all, it's an argument for thinking through what our interests are and what our goals are, and shifting them with every new sandstorm serves nobody but our adversaries. Our fiscal state, among other things, demands no less. The military has said, and I, of course, strongly agree, that the accumulated deficit is a major national security challenge. That means we're going to have to be careful how we spend our money. We're going to have to be smart about which defense programs and weapons systems we greenlight and buy. And we're also going to have to be smart about how we deploy that power. Given a choice between relying on Russia for logistics to help support a futile war for democracy in Afghanistan, for example, on the one hand, or protecting embattled American partners in Europe from Russia when they need us, I think that's kind of a no-brainer. We have to husband our forces and conserve our scarce resources, and that's what serious conservatives and serious policymakers do. The next point is that we need a bipartisan consensus on national security of the type we had during the Cold War. For all the faults of our Cold War foreign policy, it had one particular virtue. There was bipartisan agreement that politics stopped at the water's edge. The reasoning was simple. Whatever your vision for what America should be, America first had to exist in a dangerous world, and it had to be secure. And that security was everybody's business because it was everybody's concern. In the Cold War, it would have been inconceivable for a U.S. president to have close business ties, much less a close personal relationship, with the leader of a country that was actively hostile to the United States. If that power interfered in our elections, no matter who was in power, stopping that from happening again would have been of vital importance. And both parties, even if they might sometimes be skeptical of the military or intelligence community, believed they had a central role to play in our national security. We need to return to a bipartisan foreign policy. We can disagree on any number of things, but adherence to foreign powers, tolerating their involvement in our politics, and making partisan issues out of national security decisions have all got to stop. The next point is that we need a sensible border policy, and we need to link that to our foreign policy. This again comes down to not playing partisan games with major security issues and avoiding absurd extremism. We're going to need some form of border security, and it cannot be kicked to the states. The federal government needs to lead here. At the same time, we can't be putting kids in cages and pardoning law enforcement officers who run inhumane detention centers. We're violating the Constitution by ignoring Congress to steal private land to build a pointless wall. We need a combination of more intelligent border enforcement, more work visas, not less, more work visas so that people who want to work here legally and the people who want to employ them can do so, and a Western Hemisphere diplomatic strategy to deal with mass migration at the source. We share a hemisphere, all of us countries. We need a hemisphere-wide dialogue on what kind of a hemisphere we want to live in. None of this is easy, and trade-offs will be necessary. Balance has to be our watchword here. That brings me to the next point. Important issues do arise in a globalized world, and we need to lead on them. The big one, and I'll admit it's challenging when it involves a major potential rival, is global climate change. Anyone who's watched me at all during the last year knows how seriously I take this issue. It's not a hoax, and it demands attention. The risks of the ice caps melting if atmospheric temperature rises due to carbon emissions are too great to ignore. It's time to remind ourselves of a relevant statement by John F. Kennedy. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal. Something is going to be done about this issue. The risks are too great. So the question is, do we spend tons of money and cripple our industries, as some suggest, or do we define the problem using the best science available and then build consensus behind the most effective, least painful policies possible? Do we, for example, target the actual problem with a limited fee on carbon, combined again with international diplomacy to achieve a global consensus on this? I know what I think. State and local governments right now are filling the vacuum at the top. This is creative, but it ultimately is not going to be enough. To that end, of course, as I've said, I would rejoin the Paris Accords. They aren't perfect. They aren't a demon either. We're also going to have to negotiate, obviously, with the world's leading polluters. We need to engage with China and others on this issue as we do on security problems in the Pacific region. You've just got to do it. This is not for the faint-hearted, but it is imperative to do so. The other global issue that I want to bring up, because it's something that has been deliberately neglected by Mr. Trump and others, is the issue of women's advancement worldwide. As the world gets smaller, how we talk about issues is connected to how other people do. And that sets the agenda for an awful lot of people at home and abroad. The bottom line is that we need to treat women's advancement as a global issue, and we need to invest in women around the globe every way we can. One easy fix would be to reappoint an ambassador at large for global women's issues. This post has been tellingly vacant since the start of the Trump administration. That fact sends a message, and that message is indifference. It's my firm belief, borne out by evidence, just think of Grameen Bank as one tiny example, that small investments to promote women's rights and empowerment and to harness the U.S. government behind those investments pay dividends for global security and the global economy. And there is a moral dimension that does not get mentioned at all. U.S. and NATO policies in Afghanistan empowered women in a male-dominated culture, and whatever else may happen, we can be proud of that at least. And we do have to change the way we treat women's dignity within our own policy apparatus. I'm the only Republican presidential candidate who has signed the Leadership Council on Women in National Security pledge to seek gender parity in national security appointments. Doesn't cost anything. Seemed like a no-brainer. I guess Mr. Trump differs. But we need more initiatives like that. For instance, I also support a group called Protect Our Defenders, which fights for justice against sexual harassment in the military. That's Nancy Parrish's organization. This brings me to the next point. we need to rebuild the Republican Party's credentials as a party that can be trusted with the nation's and the free world's security. You cannot run for President of the United States in a Republican primary without talking about where to take the Republican Party. And I address this subject now in hopes that some of my fellow Republicans may hear it. As I said in an op-ed for the Bulwark this past week, I still call myself a Republican because I still believe in the party I joined when I was 18 years old. I still believe in personal freedom and responsibility, protection for American institutions, reverence for the founders' ideals, free markets and the right to keep what you make in them, and a government that is the people's servant and protector rather than their master. And I believe those core principles still extend to our foreign policy. I can understand how Republicans who love their country could believe we have mishandled such issues as terrorism from abroad, or unlawful immigration, or political correctness, or 1,000 other things. That doesn't make Mr. Trump any less of a wrong turn, but I surely understand the passions behind him. Mr. Trump, though, is a mistake, and a mistake for our standing in the world as well as our institutions here at home, a mistake that needs to be corrected. We, the Republicans, should be the party of free trade and capitalism again. It's a myth that free trade is only for corporations. It's also what gets crops to market and keeps prices down in the stores. Ordinary Americans benefit from it. We could go back to being their friend when it comes to the way our economy interacts with the rest of the world. We should be the party of national security again. The closest friends we have in the world are the wealthy, powerful democracies we stood alongside in the last great war for freedom, and the ones we liberated and helped get back on their feet. Russia is now trying to play those countries off against each other and scare them back into submission. We need to go back to a time when we protected freedom and democracy in its heartland. We should also go back to a time when we defended it in the Pacific. I do think China has to be handled carefully, and I think we have to be realistic, again, about what can be accomplished regarding a big power's internal affairs. But where our allies are concerned, we have to stand together. That's why I believe the Trans-Pacific Partnership was necessary and why it is so maddening that Mr. Trump mistakenly thought China would be a dominant member when China was not to be a member at all. We could and should go back to building coalitions among free peoples. We should be the party of freedom again. We should stop making excuses for dictators and setting a terrible example on our own border. And we should be the party of competence and statesmanship again, the party of Eisenhower, of Nixon's genius on this point, of Reagan, who won the Cold War, and Bush 41, who brought it to a peaceful conclusion and figured out what to do after it. I'm often skeptical when I hear the word vision, but I guess that's part of what makes me a conservative. A conservative's vision incorporates the lessons of history, or what has been shown to work and what has not in times past, even as it addresses new and future challenges. A conservative's vision is always about the common good of our national commonwealth. And that's where I want to leave off. We're still a young country, but we're getting older. We have experience to draw on. We have learned a lot about what works and what does not work in various foreign interactions. Foreign policy is most successful, and by this I mean delivers the most good to the most people, when it is based on careful, thoughtful, informed consideration of all the factors in play. And that's what we sure could use a lot more of right now. Thank you very much.
Terrific. Thank you. I invite you to come over this way.
Great. Thank you.
Well, Governor Weld, thank you again so much for being here and sharing your views. And I want to take an opportunity to unpack some of those ideas and priorities that you talked about.
You notice they were packed.
They were packed. There's a lot of substance in what you presented to us. And I want to start in Asia and China. Many people see China as a growing, the noun is wide open, competitor, threat to the United States. People point to rising Chinese military capabilities, more aggressive behavior in the region. Others point on the economic front to China stealing intellectual property, challenging the U.S. perhaps unfairly in economic competition. How do you see the relationship with China going forward, and what are the most important concerns, and what should our goals be in that relationship?
There's 2 points as to China we cannot compromise on. One is intellectual property. They really do want to reverse engineer every single thing they can get their hands on. They changed their criminal law in 2008 based on the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1892. They said whoever interferes with the full free exploitation of intellectual property, which is licensed part of a joint venture between a foreign company and a Chinese company, shall be guilty of blah, 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 monopolization and restraint of trade, criminal offense. So anyone who objects to the Chinese stealing intellectual property from a co-venturer is guilty of a criminal offense. That's got to stop and be rolled back. I advise legal clients not to sign a joint venture with a Chinese company if they have any IP they care about at all. The other thing, I think you referred to unfair competition. When Xi Jinping got in, he said, and it was music to my ears, he said, we're not going to have these SOEs, these state-owned enterprises, depending on huge subsidies from the national government again. They're going to have to be every tub on its own body and go compete in Africa or wherever based on what they can bring to the table. And that was fine for about 6 months. And then the subsidies just came flooding, scudding right back in. And now the Chinese are, for example, beating our brains in Africa because they've got the full weight of the Chinese government behind the SOEs. So they come in and they say, well, here, we've already built your railroad. The Chinese National Railway Company can build a railroad miles every day. It's amazing, the technology. They're very good at it. You know, they'll come in and say, well, we already built a new road from your capital, into town before you asked for it. We built all these schools and hospitals before you asked for it. And all we want is a lousy 15-year take-or-pay contract for all your palladium and uranium and the precious metals that are relevant to national security. Rhenium is essential in jet engines, and there's not that much of it around. So that's got to be rolled back as well, perhaps quoting Xi Jinping's words back to him. Having said those 2 semi-bellicose things, let me also say that I think I know exactly what Xi Jinping meant when he said, while taking office, we, United States and China, have 1,000 reasons to be friends. I think we do. And I think what he meant was we have 1,000 touch points, and we're the 2 big guys in the world at large. And when I was in office as governor, I used to love to do multi-corner deals with the legislature, you know. If you repeal the long-term capital gains tax, I'll support a legislative pay raise, which, by the way, I supported anyway, so I got a win on both sides. But, you know, those aren't unholy deals. I thought both of those things were good for the Commonwealth. And I can see, for example, the problem with the Koreas. I could see going to China saying, look, I know the North Koreans are not too keen about all those missiles aimed at them from 9 miles away. Not 90 miles, as in the case of Cuba and Florida, 9 miles. And I imagine that possibly you, the Chinese, are not thrilled with that either, since you're standing right behind North Korea. But I don't know. I had a funny idea the other day. What if you leaned on them a little bit and said, look, we're responsible for whatever prosperity you have in your country, and you know, because we're your market and we're your protector and defender, And we don't like this situation with the two Koreas, with you and the South. So what we're going to say to you is we'd like to be more of a market for you and help build prosperity. And we've got our dumb counterparty here in the United States says they'd like to do that too, because they think one of the irritants in the Korean Peninsula is that the North is starving to death, which it kind of is. We wouldn't say that, but we'd paint the vision of, Pyongyang as Saigon, if you will. And so that'd be point A. And then point B, we would empower the Chinese to say, and we think we can get the Americans to just take their foot off the gas pedal a little bit in South Korea and maybe do something about troop levels or something about, probably more likely, missile levels. And maybe we can have a multi-party deal here that would just lower the temperature. And it wouldn't be said at the outset that you're going to lose your nuclear weapons program. That would be for later. I will confess that I've long been a proponent of reunification of the peninsula. I worked with Don Gregg on that back in '91 when he was the ambassador. And we came very close, and there was a big delegation was going to go from Seoul up to Pyongyang, and everybody was very excited about it. 3 or 4 days before the appointed meeting, the North said it had to withdraw because it had just learned that all the delegates from South Korea had syphilis, and they were worried about this as a public health threat to the North. So that was a rather stark withdrawal from an agreed meeting, and it didn't go anywhere for a while after that. But now, particularly with the new leadership in South Korea, I think something like that might have something of a chance, and it would be calling Xi Jinping on what he meant by 1,000 reasons to be friends.
So in terms of our China relationship, issues that have been very prominent in the news include the ongoing protests in Hong Kong, the treatment of the Uyghur minority, the horrific treatment of the Uyghur minority in northwestern China. To what extent should those issues affect U.S. policy toward China?
I don't think you can go without mentioning them. My law firm has done a lot of work representing Uyghurs. We haven't lost a single case, which means the facts are not good for the government there. What handsome people, by the way, my goodness. And I've been involved or a close observer of the situation in Hong Kong since before the handover. I was friendly with Anson Chan before the handover, and with Deng Qiuhua after he took over in '97. I attended that, become very friendly with Deng Qiuhua over the years. He and I are members of a group called the Interaction Council, which is former world leaders. Everybody except me is a former head of state, but I met these guys in my travels. Most of the last 15 years I've spent international law and business matters. So they elected me a member, and Deng Qiuhua just shakes his head talking about trying to negotiate free trade with Donald Trump, because Trump, of course, by his own account, thinks everything is a zero-sum game. And they're the enemy, and you have to be unreasonable with them and beat them down and get a better deal that way for yourself. That's not a great, the art of the deal is not a great prescription for how to conduct international diplomacy, in my humble opinion. And I was in a meeting in Beijing with the Interaction Council a couple of months ago, and Wang Qishan met us, who's, depending who you ask, the number 2 or number 3 man in China, and he's the guy who ran the anti-corruption probe for Xi Jinping. A very powerful guy, and he spoke very timidly to us for about half an hour, and someone mentioned that I had been head of the criminal division and had made public corruption my #1 priority, so I got to peel off with him. Enormously sophisticated. I mean, these people at the top are enormously sophisticated, and if we can't be sophisticated back, we're really squandering an opportunity.
So I want to shift to another part of the world, which is the Middle East, which you touched on in your remarks, and you talked about being more discriminating in the way in which we engage in that region. One of the issues that has been top of mind has been our relationship with Iran, concerns about their nuclear program, as well as their activities in the region.
supporting varieties of militias and disruptive groups there. What would your approach be to Iran? Let's start with the nuclear situation.
I thought Mr. Trump ripping up that treaty was perhaps the biggest bonehead play of any of his treaty ripping up exercises. We had Iran on a course to a 10-year hiatus in any move towards having nuclear weapons, and they were in compliance. And we rip up the treaty, and guess what? It wasn't a bipolar treaty. Our Western European allies were parties to it too, and they were kind of scratching their heads, or they weren't too surprised given what had gone before. But I thought that was a disaster, and I would rejoin it without conditions. I wouldn't say I'm coming back only if you promise to do this and that and the other. It's the only way to do that, and you know, I'm under no illusions that Iran is any day at the beach when it comes to supporting terrorism in the region. But I'd start there, and that's not even much of a step. I've spent a lot of time in Israel since the 80s. In the old days, I used to go pub crawling with Bibi Netanyahu, Ehud Olmert, and Danny Meridor, and all these guys became president of the country. It was the Likud Young Guard back in the 80s. And Abe Sofer, who had been legal advisor to the State Department, had an apartment in Jerusalem, so we all congregated there. So I got to know Bibi very well over the years. And then over time, I got to know Shimon Peres even better. And he and I would exchange letters and books. And he's the man who always said international economic development projects are the sinews of peace. I totally agree with that. And his detractors say, oh, Shimon was a dreamer. Well, okay, I'll take that. Thank you very much in the context of Israel and the Palestinians. And I'm a two-state person. I think a one-state solution just means you have to have the Palestinians give up everything and Israel would run the state. And I also, I'm not sure that Mr. Trump hasn't been romancing Mr. Netanyahu in sort of alt-right directions, which I think is not the way to go. I think, again, we have to take our foot off the accelerator a little bit. And when I say in those remarks, we got to be careful, I think we got to be careful about saying, okay, we're here. The end is in sight. We're just about to have a solution to Middle East, and we'll let you know when we figure it out and let you know what it is. And I think it's got to come from those folks, not from the United States, or there will be resentment and it won't stick.
So some people argue that given our oil wealth today and our reduced dependence on oil in the Middle East, that strategically the Middle East is actually far less important to the United States. And with other pressing problems in the world, we have far less of a reason to be there. For you, kind of what are those core interests that we ought to engage in that region, and are there things we should let go of?
Well, it is true. I can remember, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago reading that Saudi Arabia's oil would run out in 92 years. And I started looking at my watch. Of course, they always discover more when it looks like the clock is going to run out. You know, the vast energy wealth of the United States, which is a creature of just the last few years, really changes the price of poker in a lot of things. And I think there's something in what you are hinting at there. Certainly today, I'm not saying this did happen, but today we would not invade a Middle Eastern country for any reason having anything to do with oil. We wouldn't need to, and that's a real blessing. And I know a lot about Eastern Europe and the Baltics and Ukraine and what Putin is trying to do with Belarus and knocking down those countries one by one. He makes no secret of the fact that he wants the boundaries of Russia to go back to being those of the Soviet Union. And he has said that you know, the loss of the Cold War was the greatest international tragedy in his lifetime. So he's not joking around.
So how do we manage that? What do we do? He continues, I mean, he's occupied Crimea, annexed it. He continues to put pressure on eastern Ukraine. So as you point out, these are active policies.
I would have a long, if I get there to 1600 Pennsylvania, I would have a long series of talks with Mr. Putin. And, you know, I ran the criminal division of the Justice Department, and the FBI and CIA reported to me on criminal issues, so I've got a certain amount of experience in the black world. He has a lot of experience in the black world. He was head of the KGB, and, you know, John McCain famously said, I look in his eyes and I see 3 letters, KGB. But, you know, he knows I know he's KGB, and he knows I know how he thinks. And he probably knows how I think, because I was kind of an aggressive head of the criminal division on international affairs. If we couldn't find someone, you know, if we couldn't scoop some very bad guy in his country, we'd find a nice Caribbean country where he had a girlfriend and a police apparatus that was friendly to the United States. That'd be the end of him. Some people thought that was dirty pool. I didn't. But no, just let him know that we're going to stop at nothing here. And, you know, Latvia, Estonia, we're not going to let you play the game you're playing. And we know what the game is. And, you know, you think you've been able to relax recently from the missiles aimed at you from Eastern Europe and Western Europe. Think again. Well, I think that would get his attention because he hates that.
Okay. Terrific. And, you know, let's just focus just a little more on Ukraine itself. Is that something that the United States should continue to supply military weapons
of all those countries, and I referred in my remarks to both Eastern Europe and Western Europe, you know, the ones who were in the last war and the other ones who right next to them. Of all those countries, Ukraine is the most sensitive and the most important. They're not a NATO ally, but they're hugely important in the context of the EU and both Western and Eastern Europe, partly because Putin did annex Crimea, partly because the Ukrainians have shown many times, not once, not twice, but 3 times, that they're willing to spill blood to stop the Russians. And they've had, you know, not insubstantial casualties there. They need these Javelin missiles to stop the Russian tanks. And, you know, even when there was footage every night of the Russian tanks rolling across the border into eastern Ukraine, they were saying, oh, no, we have no tanks there. We don't know what you're talking about. It was kind of like hearing the White House press secretary talk.
So one of the other areas that you emphasized a great deal in your remarks was the importance of trade and the benefits of trade in the world. And a couple things on this. One is this administration has adopted the use of tariffs to put pressure on other countries to try to produce trade outcomes it wants, as well as a focus on working bilaterally. Previously, the United States had primarily pursued its trade interests through multilateral deals, through support of the WTO. So a couple different questions here. As you think about advancing a trade agenda, is that primarily a bilateral set of negotiations? Is that a restoration of the multilateral institutions? How do you go about getting the kind of positive trade relationship that you want to achieve?
Well, I mean, multilateral works. The WTA was a big step forward globally. I personally participated in the formation of NAFTA, working with Bill Clinton in the White House and Newt Gingrich in the House to get the Republican votes that we needed to get NAFTA through. I remember being in the White House with Bill Daley of Chicago and Clinton and Gingrich just counting noses the night before the vote. So that's been, and I worked, you know, closely with Salinas and 𝗦𝗘𝗥𝗜𝗖𝗔 and Pedro Aspe, the finance minister, on that, and Michael Wilson in Canada. So I've seen that work. The president, unfortunately, has a massive lack of understanding of how free trade and foreign trade actually works. And this is something Deng Xiaoping has said to me incredulously, and people in Mexico have said to me, that the president thinks that a car manufactured in North America is either made in Mexico, or it's made in the United States, or it's made in Canada. And the fact is that a car made in North America travels across the Mexican border 22 times because the chassis moves every time you're getting to a different stage of production, requiring a different wage level to sustain it. So a combination of thinking everything is a zero-sum game, which is a disaster, and taking the first page out of The Art of the Deal and saying, I'm going to approach every international diplomatic, not to say just trade, any diplomatic entretien by saying, tariff, sanction, sanction, tariff, tariff, sanction. I'm beating you over the head with all of those things, and that proves that I'm strong and not weak, and may I say, insecure, not insecure. So it's just no way to approach a negotiation, you know. So sue me. I like to leave a little meat on the table for the other guy so he'll want to do business with me again.
And in terms of kind of specific areas to engage, the TTP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or what's now the CPTPP, what's your attitude toward that agreement? You indicated that you thought it was a bad idea for us to leave it. Is that something we should re-engage?
The whole conception of the TPP, pardon me, I haven't got to the new initials yet.
CPTPP?
Yeah. Was to give us a beachhead of 12 Pacific-facing nations, 6 on the Asian side, 6 on the American side, in an organization where China would not be a member. So it would give us a 12-nation beachhead in Asia without China at the table. Unfortunately, Mr. Trump, when deciding to rip up that particular treaty, didn't know that China was not going to be a member. In fact, he said, the basis for what I'm doing is that this will be monopolized by China. Now, that level of ignorance really should not be permitted at that level in the White House. But Mr. Trump has said that, and this is him talking, not me talking, he doesn't need to listen to anybody. He doesn't need a bunch of experts and professors and professionals from the bureaucracy, the hated swamp, because he knows more than they do. It's what he says, not me. So that was unfortunate, to put it mildly, the TPP.
And you'd rejoin?
Oh yeah, again, without conditions.
Great, terrific. Another area that you emphasized was climate change and the importance and priority that you would apply to climate change. It's an issue in which there is partisan divide in this country. How do you think about moving forward and building a consensus around a climate agenda, and what would that look like? You mentioned carbon tax as one possibility.
It wouldn't be that hard, you know, either by a congressional enactment or by a presidential declaration of national emergency, indeed planetary emergency. You would put a price on carbon. And the major emitters are the coal companies, the oil companies, the gas companies, and the mining companies. And you would say to them, you're going to pay a fee of, pick a number, $40, $50 per ton of carbon that you put into the atmosphere. And it'll go to the federal treasury. So far that looks like a tax. But actually the proceeds, which would be only $500 billion a year, would be remitted to taxpayers. So I don't call it a tax. I call it a fee, and I think that's correct. It's a fee on those industries in the interests of the common good. And you could send it back to the taxpayers either through payroll tax relief, and if I did that, I would aim that at the bottom 20% of taxpayers, because I am worried about income inequality now more than before, because I'm worried about social cohesion. And Mr. Trump has torn up the social fabric enough. So I think it's high time to start, yes, listening to the pleas about income inequality. Or you could use some for infrastructure where, you know, people rightly point out that we look like a third world country in far too many contexts. But what would happen is that the settled price per ton would respond to the market would respond to the pricing signals sent by the floating up of that number. And we wouldn't have to shoot Bessie the cow, and we wouldn't have to stop flying airplanes. We would be influencing how much carbon goes into the atmosphere in connection with energy production. That's what we're about at the end of the day. You know, the first draft of 𝗦𝗘𝗥𝗜𝗖𝗔 𝗜𝗡's Green New Deal had nuclear power in it. But the very, very beautiful people made her take that out because they said it's not clean because it's got waste. Well, first of all, the newest generation of small nuclear plants, not fortresses like they built on a barrier reef in Fukushima, but little ones like France has. This generation consumes its own waste. End of that problem. Don't even need Yucca Mountain. So I think small nuclear plants should probably be about 25% of the base. They emit 0 carbon. You know, people have been sitting around for a long time saying, why can't somebody invent something that produces a huge amount of energy and has no carbon emission whatsoever? And they invented it a long time ago, and it's called the atom. So that'd be a partial answer to how to get a good leg up on the deal. And I would, you know, it's going to require the President of the United States to put his or her shoulder against the wheel to get acceptance of nuclear power, because we think about 3 Mile Island, we think of Chernobyl, we think of Fukushima, these massive plants. And what the French did in the 70s or 80s when they went to 75% nukes for all of their power, which, by the way, is the sharpest drop in carbon going into the atmosphere ever recorded when the French did that. And they have these little vest pocket plants. And, you know, I've been around the country, this country, enough to know that there are many, many counties, for example, in upstate New York, which already have 1 nuclear plant, which would love to have another one because they're great employers and they're great neighbors and they're totally stable. And there's just propaganda has scared a lot of people thinking that nuclear equals eek, and we've got to get away from that.
Very good. Just want to remind the audience, both online and in the room, that you can submit questions to ccga.live, and we've got a number of them that people have submitted already. One of those is looking at the complicated issues that you presented in your talk. Many of them are subject to misinformation. How would you bring meaningful discourse back to the table so that we're talking about facts and that these debates aren't skewed, distorted, and pushed off reality through misinformation?
Well, a lot of that is cybersecurity, which is not my longest suit because it's so damn technical. But I've been briefed by former heads of the CIA and discussions with members of the Joint Chiefs. And you have to make it more painful for the other nation, read Russia, although China and Iran, and North Korea are right at the table too. More painful for them to hack than it is beneficial to them to get the information. And that involves a lot of stuff that's well into the black world. So I think that has to be done.
Mm-hmm. And how about political discourse in this country, which
well,
also
that's easy.
is characterized?
That's easy. You know, the first months I was in office in Massachusetts, I called up the Speaker of the House and the Senate President and said, let's have a social get-together, say Monday afternoons. And Mr. Speaker, we'll have the first one in your office, and then Mr. President in your office, and then we'll rotate after that. I didn't even say the third one would be in my office because legislators hate being summoned to a governor's office. But we did that for both of my 2 terms, and it's been adopted by every governor, every Senate president, every speaker since then, and those meetings are still taking place every Monday afternoon. And it ushered in, from the beginning, a golden era in relationship between the parties in Massachusetts. You know, agreed revenue projections, for example, so we don't have catfights about that every year. And Washington could take a page from that book. I mean, if I could turn the clock back to meetings of the Board of Education between Speaker Sam Rayburn and Lyndon Johnson, which was a euphemism for bourbon and branch water in the office under the stairs. I'd like to think it's after 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Not so sure about that in the 40s and 50s. But, you know, as one of the Senate presidents, a Democrat, said in Massachusetts when his left wing was attacking him for doing business with the enemy, he said, look, goodwill begets goodwill. And we did massive reforms of the education system, more money in exchange for accountability and standards, massive reforms of the welfare system, little work requirement, nothing onerous. Welfare rolls went down 70% immediately. That tells you something. And that became the basis for the 1996 welfare reform law that Bill Clinton passed. And we were able to do that because we weren't suspicious of each other, because we sort of let down the guard at these social meetings. So I would first of all have a bipartisan cabinet. I don't rule out even throwing in a libertarian to give everybody a tickle, keep them honest. But I'd certainly have a bunch of R's and D's. And, I would reach across the aisle to Congress on day one and say essentially what I said to the Democrats in Massachusetts. And, people respond to tactfulness. And Tom Birmingham, the Senate president, was right. Goodwill does beget goodwill. So I think if I got there with my, disposition to engage in that kind of discussion, I think the atmosphere in Washington would change overnight. And don't think I wouldn't use that fabulous East Room to have all kinds of parties in the White House all the time with all kinds of different people from around town who ordinarily would not be supping at the same table.
Good. So another question that's asked is a relationship question, and it is, how would you rebuild trust with our allies? This president has had lots of negative things to say about our European allies, about our Asian allies
one of
at
the
different
first
times.
things
How do you fix that?
Well, you give a speech in Europe, saying, oh, thank you, NATO, maybe hosted by NATO. We really need you folks for this. And then repeating some of the history of Western Europe and Eastern Europe that we've just been talking about to show that I understand that. And I probably would not, in that speech, wave the bloody shirt at Russia. I might conspicuously not do that, but I'd be giving enough history so that they would know that, hell, if you listen to those remarks, it's like our first port of call is to make sure that we're supporting those democracies. So I'd let them know that. Might even give that speech.
Very good. An issue that people have asked about, very current in the news, is the coronavirus. If you were president, what kinds of measures would you take to keep the American public safe?
I probably would offer to send some help, financial help, their way to help them do what they have to do. Certainly, that's a little more awkward with China than it would be in Africa with West Nile virus or Ebola. But just as I would send aid to El Salvador and Honduras and Guatemala to remediate the conditions that are sending those people across the border, I would make helpful gestures to show that we understand in terms of keeping it out of the United States, whatever protocols at the border and quarantines had to be engaged in. And, I did follow, I'm doing business in the Democratic Republic of Congo in Africa, and you damn well have to pay attention to quarantine requirements or you're not doing your country any favor.
Yeah. Another question here is, can you give us an example of a world leader who you admire?
Well, Shimon Peres was a substantial friend, and I admired Mary Robinson, who was my contemporary in office when she was president of Ireland, and she moved the country a great deal. She took some of the venom out of the abortion issue. She went on to serve as High Commissioner for Human Rights, I think, at the UN, and was all over the world, and she's just a spectacular person. Matter of fact, I've probably met more spectacular foreign leaders than I have American leaders in my day. If only one or two people are going to swim to the top of a country, they're presumably pretty able, or the opposite.
So I've got another question which picks up nicely on that, which is, in your view, which U.S. president had the best foreign policy?
Oh, I don't know, maybe Bush 41.
Okay. Any particular reason? Anything you admired about his foreign policy?
Well, yeah. So I was in office in late '91, and I think that was when Yeltsin was standing on the tank, and so everyone thought, oh my God, there's going to be this coup, and and Bush 41 took to the airwaves, and this is Bush 41, the former head of the CIA, talking, which is why I say law enforcement experience is helpful. And he said, I want to remind the American people that coups don't always succeed. And he already knew that this one was not going to be a disaster. So that paved the way for Yeltsin to stand on the tank and things to come out in quite a good way, not a bad way.
Good. So there's a question that you referred to briefly that I want to just give you a chance to talk a little more about, which is how would you address the root causes of migration in Central America? You'd mentioned just a moment ago about providing support to some of those countries that are the sending countries. What would the goals of that policy be, and how would you go about doing that?
Well, I'll tell you, the best way to address the root causes from Mexico is to build north-south roads down, straight south, down to Oaxaca and Guerrero and the Mexican states where people, the indigenous population and other people are just finding it very hard to get enough to live on because there's no prosperity to speak of. And NAFTA has been great for all three countries, but on the Mexican side, the prosperity was to a substantial degree limited to the maquiladoras right along the border.
Factories up in the northern part of the country.
Yeah, and so without 6-lane highways going down south, you're not going to spread that prosperity. This is why, Bill Clinton offered me my choice of ambassadorships, Court of St. James in the United Kingdom, New Delhi in India, or Mexico City. No one in the world except me would have chosen Mexico City. But I like to work, and I knew that Jesse Helms and other members of the chorus, Jesse at that point, speak well of the dead, but I'll just point out that he would refer to Mexicans as wetbacks in speeches on the floor of the Senate. I kind of thought that if I got down there, and it was the high watermark of my relations with the Republicans in Congress, because when they got in '95, they had me and John Engler from Michigan, Tommy Thompson from Wisconsin come down and lecture them about what we had done. We cut taxes a lot and were hung in effigy our first terms, and then all got over 70% of the vote on our re-elect, because cutting taxes a lot is pretty good for the employment rate, good for small business. So I was going to go to Bill Archer in Houston and others and persuade them that instead of focusing on the negativity, immigration and narcotics trafficking, we should focus on economic development, and that would be the way to stop the bad things, because it's not only what makes people come illegally across the border, it also supports the narcotics trafficking to get money by whatever means into those southern states. But it was not to be, because I never got to Mexico City.
Very good. As time runs out, I want to ask a question which really draws on your long experience in public service, and is what words of encouragement can you give to those interested in public service but who are turned off by the current political environment in this country?
Well, the political environment cannot last forever, and Mr. Trump is either going to be removed by the Senate or he's not, and then he's either going to win the 2020 election or he's not. I must say it's an unsavory situation right now, because Mr. Trump has said, if I, Donald Trump, don't win the 2020 election, there's going to be a civil war. And people are responding to that. They're stockpiling weapons. He knows that damn well. And his Rasputin Robespierre, Steve Bannon, has said if Trump is reelected, there's going to be 4 years of unrequited payback, which means, I interpret that to mean he's going to turn up the dial on his vindictiveness. Both of those are unappealing prospects, and if everybody in the United States is going to roll over and play dead for that, I'll be pricing castles in Western Ireland. I do think that when Mr. Trump leaves the scene, the political scene, for whatever reason, that there's going to be people are going to heave a huge sigh of relief and say, now finally we can get back to business. As I travel around the country in this election, I can tell you one thing, everybody all around the United States, the one thing that unites them now, they're exhausted. and it's Mr. Trump who exhausts them. They don't even want to talk about him. They don't want to talk at all about him. And so if he were not, the incubus on top of us, I think people, all kinds of people, Trump people, anti-Trump people, would relax. I think it'd be good for gross domestic product, probably add about 3 hours to the day of productive labor, people not having to watch the news for 3 hours a day or 7 hours a day. So I'm one of those, and I'm a minority who thinks that when Mr. Trump leaves the senior councils of the Republican Party, that the dominant mood is going to be, thank God that's over. Was that a bad dream, or did that really happen? And then they'll go back to being the nice people they were before. I know all these senior Republicans in the Senate. They're nice people. They're very able people. And I talk to some of them even. And boy, are they tiptoeing around and choosing their words.
Well, one of the things that elections create is an opportunity to talk about important issues.
Well, this is why I'm running.
And I was just going to thank you for coming here and sharing your ideas in this really important public dialogue. And thank you so much for coming to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs.
Thank you, Brian.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.